Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix / TC Ricks. This is Micronation Chapter 5. I am Watson. I am Moriarty. I am Moriarty. I am Watson. But I was a technical writer. My job was to chronicle the self-styled expeditions of would-be Sherlock Holmes named Quiescence Prow. That was what he paid me to do. Along the way, he stole the woman I love. Thus, I was determined to destroy him. I would turn his penchant for the unusual against him and expose him as a fool to the world. Little did I know that some of Prow's explorations into the fantastic were the real thing. Why am I writing this down now, you ask? My habit of writing my thoughts was forced at first, but now I find myself almost compelled to do it. I must write down what I do, no matter how much it pains me. That does not stop me from skewing things to my perspective. In truth, I've been doing that for some time. All Prow ever cared about was the fact that his adventures were being recorded. He never actually read them. He read a lot. Indeed, his bizarre home in the Arizona desert must have had thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of books. However, for all his learning, Prow is still a fool. He's a lucky fool, to be sure. Fate smiles on him in ways I do not comprehend, but then it gave me a true purpose in life, so how can I fault him for that? I do not wish to kill Prow, only to ruin him. The first time we'd gone to Alaska, we found a device capable of supposedly seeing into the past. It was there that I got the idea to fake a man from the future. You see, I now know something about him that other people do not. Quiescence Prow lives to find the unusual. He wants to find alien spaceships or ancient Atlantean ruins. The world for him is a very boring place, so he makes up for that by being a consulting detective like one of his heroes, Sherlock Holmes. And thus it was I began to set my plan in motion. I was a bit timid at first. For all his foolishness, Prow was very competent, and the third member of our little trio, Darla, is even sharper still. Darla is intelligent, beautiful, and emotionally secure. She is the most perfect woman I have ever known. True, she is narcoleptic, obsessive-compulsive, and blunt, but I like that about her. Prow could not care less. He doesn't even see her, just like Darla doesn't see me. I asked her out once, and she shot me down cold. Then she pretended like it never happened. That was when I decided to destroy Prow. Darla walked in, as she had for nearly 2 years, and set several files in front of Prow. Prow's usual routine was to look through them, one at a time, and try and decide which one interested him most. This time was different, though. This time, he included a very special file I had maneuvered myself. "This is interesting," Prow said, examining one of the files that was not the one I had put there. "It apparently involves a giant squid off an oil drilling platform. They want me to consider whether or not it's a new species." My first reaction was to say how stupid that idea was. Prow was not a biologist. None of us were. Somehow, people kept hiring him to do all these things he had no expertise at. He kept solving them. I bit my tongue. Prow often used my annoyance to gauge how outlandish an idea was. I was his straight man. I had finally figured him out. He needed someone to tell him how impossible the task was to accomplish. I said nothing. Prow looked at me silently and then sighed. He continued looking through the papers. This is interesting. This person thinks that they've discovered King Solomon's mines. Are you Indiana Jones or Sherlock Holmes, Prow? Make up your mind. That's what I wanted to say. I still didn't reply. He took out another file. This person is apparently requesting independent verification of an event that occurred in upstate New York. There's no such thing as time travel, I blurted out. Oh, great. I had spoken too soon, curse it all. Prow looked at me, startled. What did you say? He asked. They're probably talking about that idiot on the internet who claims he's from the future. He supposedly predicted when a meteorite would hit the ground in upstate New York. Interesting, Prow thought. Look, anyone could predict something like that. Something like what? Darla asked. Prow replied, well, apparently someone in upstate New York believes that they are being blackmailed by someone claiming to be from the future. Darla raised an eyebrow. Really? I don't remember preparing that file. I smiled. It must have been Amberlove. Amberlove was another narcoleptic friend of Darla's, who had helped Darla with some of her coursework. Darla kept trying to fix this up. I think she felt guilty. It only annoyed me more. Darla frowned. Prow ignored her as he usually did and replied to my skepticism. Perhaps, but there are other, far more disturbing things here that are not so easily explained. Oh? I asked casually. Like what? Prow began to pace back and forth on his velvet carpet, ticking off points from his raised fingertips. 3 things. By themselves, they would be relatively minor, but together they are quite significant. First, the gentleman who sent me this file was visited by a so-called visitor from the future. He told the prospective client on the plane that he was going to crash into a nearby lake by accident at a precise date and time. That is public knowledge, and the FAA looked into the matter with little success. What other people, even the well-informed, do not necessarily know about are the death of the family from his uncle of a heart attack, and a public announcement of a cure for a rare but very nasty blood disorder called Cartick's disease. Anyone could have faked that stuff, I said. Darla had fallen asleep. She looked beautiful, but she was probably dreaming of Prow. Maybe, Prow replied. I can see that point. We have been fooled before, it is true. And yet, the idea that someone could have staged all 4 is preposterous. The resources required to do so would be astronomical. Furthermore, they would have had to have massive connections in the government and scientific industry, and be willing to commit murder to advance their cause. What kind of monster would be intelligent enough to pull something like that off, and yet simply desire to defraud the victim of some of his earthly possessions? Aha! So this visitor from the future is asking for money? It always comes down to that. It's not that simple. Yes, it would be expensive, but the time traveler is actually advocating that the victim place a certain amount in a well-regulated trust fund to acquire property for a certain sale. The would-be time traveler says that this site is going to become very important in the future, but that he cannot explain why. Wonderful thing about the future, it's always so vague. I read your horoscope today, Prow. It says that you shouldn't believe everything you read. Prow chuckled. I am not saying that we should not go into this without a healthy sense of skepticism. So you're saying that we should go into it with a healthy sense of disbelief? Darla asked, waking up. Yes, Prow snapped, annoyed. But I think it is worth checking out. Why? Darla asked. Because it is interesting, Prow smirked. Darla pointed to a rather large stack of files. You got lots of interesting cases. Patiently, Prow nodded and then pretended those files didn't exist. Yes, I do. But this one is more interesting. I don't like it. Since when did we determine which cases we took based on which cases you don't like? I didn't like the feeling of this. I tried to win Darla over. See? She thinks it's a bad idea, too. Why do you think it's bad? Just a feeling. I wondered if she had felt my bad feeling. I don't go on feelings, Prow said. It isn't logical. Logical? I shrieked. Since when has leaping to the most bizarre conclusion imaginable been logical? There's a difference between intuition and feeling. Those who understand that do great things. Whatever, Darla said, rolling her eyes. We're all off to such a lovely start. We are going. Pack, Prow commanded. That was the end of it. It was all I could do to conceal my glee. This had worked out better than I possibly could have planned. Upstate New York, it turns out, was very pretty in the fall when the leaves are 100 different hues. That explains why we had to go in the middle of winter in one of the worst snowstorms in memory. Time and climate matter little to Prow when he's solving a case, and this one proved no exception. Make no mind that the person who had requested Prow's help was not mentioned, in any way, shape, or form, that time was of the essence. I had arranged it thus, for, after all, what did time mean to a time traveler? Prow would have seen through it at once. Prow wanted to get there as quickly as possible, and that was that. Our erstwhile employer, Jefferson Trentwine, was an amiable, portly sort of fellow. In fact, he was the one who had been born for the title Watson, not me. He was a doctor. He had that brushy mustache and the studied dignity of a pseudo-aristocrat. But the only thing he didn't have was a British accent. Welcome to my home, all of you. he said amiably. "Thank you ever so much for coming. I sincerely appreciate this. I do." Prow said, "Nothing to it." He invited us in the door. The three of us trundled in and kicked the thickened snow off our shoes, hung up our coats, unwrapped our scarves, etc. It was a tedious affair that anyone coming into or out of the snow would understand. "Would you like a cup of hot tea? Cider? Coffee?" I couldn't help noticing that the guy that had offered us tea first. Watson reincarnated, I swear. Prow raised his hand and shook his head. "No need. We're here on business." Darla shook his head. Darla said, "I'll take some coffee." "Cider," I replied. It was not what Darla was having, and it wasn't tea. Our current climate would be exported to hell before I did anything more Watson-esque. Prow looked at us both with annoyance. It was that "why can't you people sustain yourselves on the thrill of adventure alone" kind of look he gave us almost all the time. Some of us are not lunatics. "Sorry." We moved into the den. The man had a collection of whaling paraphernalia and a huge amount of whale bones. "Isn't that stuff illegal?" Darla asked. "Not if it was bought before the ban went into effect. Whaling fantasy fascinates me, both the ruggedness of the men who did it and their determination up until the very end to hunt their living to extinction. Yet at the same time, men don't ever change voluntarily. Try to put a new technology or a new methodology, and they'll fight you tooth and nail." "That's stupid," I said. "I use new technology all the time." "Not everyone is like that." "Oh, come on," he said, smiling. "There has never been a new technology you didn't like? Something that annoyed you?" Prow snarled, "Vroomba. They're highly annoying. They disturb my concentration." "There you go," Jeremy smiled. Prow coughed. "Very well. Let me start by saying that I have a solution to your time travel dilemma." "Really?" Jeremy said. "Quite excellent. What is it?" Darla looked with interest as well. She didn't say anything. "Simple. You are being had. This is a hoax, a con job, a sham, a shemeasel, a rove, a barn job, a lie. You have been sent down the river without a paddle. May I go on, or do you get the general gist of what I'm saying?" "What?" Prow was never right on his first try. He always got it wrong at least 2 or 3 times. It was an old formulaic pattern by now. I was counting on it. My entire plan was counting on it. Prow had to go to the warehouse where he would be made to look like a fool to the entire world. It was perfect. He was an idiot. This could not be correct. Jeremy didn't like this answer either. At first, his face turned a beet red. Then he began to breathe slowly and squinting his eyes to avoid something that he would regret later. "And just who do you think is responsible for this hoax, Mr. Prow?" He decided not to say, "You, sir, are calling me a fool," but his voice implied it. "There are 2 people behind this crime. The first is my incompetent assistant, Chester Offerson, otherwise known as Watson, and my would-be Moriarty, and second, unknown assailant who has taken advantage of his idiocy to do a far better job of it. Thus, the real question is, who would have the motivation to lie to you, besides Watson, that is?" I just stood there. Jarla fell to the floor. I couldn't tell if she was laughing or angry, probably both. Prow and Jeremy looked at me. Prow had this supercilious grin I'd never seen on him before. It was actually humorous without a hint of maliciousness. I hated him all the more for it, but I could tell that it was all he could do to keep from snickering. Jeremy looked upset, but extremely confused. He seemed to be taking it all rather well before he finally said, "I'm sorry, but do you mean to tell me that your assistant is the reason I hired you?" "Yes, that's right," Prow said. "Well, excuse me, I need to call my lawyer. There's a lawsuit here and probably criminal charges." "Quite probably, but I imagine you won't want to waive all that to get Watson's cooperation." "What?" Jeremy said. "Do you mean to say that you knew nothing of this?" "Yes and no. I knew Watson was attempting something like this. I just didn't know it was you." "And it was not an attempt to drum up business for yourself?" "Good heavens, no. I don't want to be famous, and I have all the money I need. I practically have people beating down my door to get me to solve things." "Then if you knew he was up to something, why did you let him do it?" "I wanted to give him enough rope to hang himself. That, and quite frankly, he needed to be taken down a peg or 2. He's far too full of himself." I choked on that. "I'm too full of myself? I'm not the one who considers himself the end-all, be-all of expert on any given situation. I'm not the one who leaps to the wrong conclusion every time and makes us all look like idiots." Darla stood up. "You are too full of yourself. You think you're all clever and in on this joke that no one else knows about. Like, for example, did you honestly think Quissy was going to pay you an entire salary to write about him doing stuff and never actually read any of it?" "Quissy," Prow said. "You are never to call me Quissy again, are we clear?" Darla blushed so hard she fell down. Apparently, A passionate conversation with a narcoleptic could be a very one-sided one. I was glad I didn't have it. Prow, bashing of sympathy that he was, didn't bite an eyelash and kept on going with his monologue. As I was saying, Watson, here was only the tip of the iceberg. I knew he had faked the death of a relative, and he faked the meteorite landing. Quite a bit of clever work there, Watson, by the way. I almost didn't figure it out. I shrugged. Faking a meteor landing wasn't as tough as people thought it was. You had to know someone with the right toys and be willing to bribe them to do it. That, or make them think it was a technical challenge. Some people are idiots. So, are you going to have me arrested? I said. That depends on if you get caught. I will say that it is not my immediate intention to see you behind bars, since I find your writings particularly interesting, but neither am I willing to commit a felony on your behalf. On the other hand, perhaps by aiding us in finding those who have perpetrated these crimes, you might be shown a bit of leniency by the prosecution. Gee, how generous of you. Given the fact that you were, as of 5 minutes ago, planning on to perpetuate a lie on Mr. Trentwine's person of titanic proportions and making him, and us, Darla interjected. Prow ignored her and continued, look like fools before the entire world. Do you really expect generous terms from me? The truth of the matter is that I like your work and you help me think. You're the catalyst by which my ideas come to fruition, but do not believe that makes you unique. You are supremely qualified, but not irreplaceable. You have grown complacent in your arrogance and the comfort of your position, and one way or another, I am afraid you will have to pay for it. Are you firing me? Hardly. If I did, you would have little or no motivation to write this adventure, now would you? True. I still might not, and yes, I know all about my contract, but that won't do me much good in jail, will it? Still, I suppose we will at least find out who these people are. Jeffrey looked at Prow and said, what have you got in mind? Prow's eyes twinkled gleefully. A trap. Here's what we will do. Well, I had to hand it to him. He managed to come up with a decent plan. It wasn't the best plan, but it was a plan. Basically, we were all going to go along with our charade of pretending like none of us had any clue about what was going on. Prow was firmly convinced it was time travel, just as I was firmly convinced he was an idiot. Just between you and me, he is an idiot, but it would have been foolish to write that, now that I know he reads these things, and yet here I am still writing it. Go figure. Thus, we called our would-be prognosticator Gilleton Horkson. I felt sorry for him when I met him. I felt sorry for him when he walked into the room, and I still feel sorry for him. Every time I heard the name, I couldn't help but think, Gilleton, the cold air in? Close the door, or let him get away. I wasn't a fourth grader. His childhood had to have been hell. Which, in the blame society kind of way, explained why he was now in the business of prophesying con man pretending to be from the future. He had a natural charisma about him. It was the kind that salespeople had, the good kind, not the ones that were so corporate-y you had to wash yourself in soap when they talked about buzz mergers or hydrodynamic interlocking paradigms. I hated corporations. At least I hated working for them. And the idea of working for one again scared the pants off me. But I had dug my grave and I was going to have to lie in it. Welcome, Prow said as Jeffrey led him into the room. I was just telling my friend here how I've become convinced that you are who you say you are. Gilleton smiled his most charming smile and nodded. How gracious of you, Quissy. Prow smiled. You know my name. Amazing. That was the closest I had ever seen Prow come to sarcasm, and it didn't suit him well. Apparently, acting like him was all fine and good when postulating things to do on a hypothetical plan, but he couldn't act his way out of a paper bag. Not surprising, really, but I didn't think Gilleton was going to buy it for a minute. Gilleton looked at Prow, and I thought the jig was up, but he played right along with it. Of course I do. I'm from the future. How would someone like me not know the world-famous Quiescence Prow? There was a time, this time there was no acting whatsoever when he beamed and nodded. You flatter me, sir. And yet I could tell he believed absolutely every word of it. One day, everyone would know who Prow was. Worse, I was helping him with his delusion. Well, how could I not? Gilleton smiled. You are a fraud and a liar, Darla said with the worst acting voice I had ever heard. I was stunned. This was a woman who lived in perpetual denial. She was a genius. She was incredibly competent, but something told me this was not part of the plan. Then again, she'd fooled me, so what did I know? Gilleton smiled his safe smile and said, I assure you, I'm not. Prove it, Darla said. Oh, be assured. That I will. For example, in approximately 15 minutes, your house is going to burn down. Darla said, I don't own a house. I stay with my employer. Are you implying that you're going to burn down the house of Quiescence Prow, your idol? No, of course not. Your mother died last night, and she was going to leave her house to you in her will, but your brother is jealous. He's going to burn it down in spite of you. But you won't be able to prove it. It was him until 20 years later when his wife leaves a confession after her death. What? Darla was shocked. I was surprised at my sympathy. This was a woman who I loved at one point, but who considered me to be less than dirt. Yet despite her coldness towards me, I found myself mildly sympathetic. Who am I kidding? I felt just as shocked and violated as she did. Maybe even more if that were possible. After all, I was the one who had started all this. Giletian said, I'm sorry. You might want to call the maid and have her get out of the house. Prow did not look happy about this. Clearly something had gone wrong in his clever plan. Not that I was surprised. Much to my surprise, I found myself speaking. Excuse me, Giletian, but I happen to know you are from the present, and I happen to know that if her house burns down, you are in a serious amount of pain. Several things happened at once. Giletian looked quite shocked that I had stepped out of character. After all, I was the one who had hired him in the first place. Prow simply smiled then, as if somehow I had done exactly what he expected me to do, and Darla looked even more horrified, as if what I said wasn't going to help at all. Giletian said, I don't know what you're talking about. Darla reached for her cell phone and began to dial as quickly as she could. I had to do something. I was supposed to be the rational person in the group. They had some elaborate plan to trick Giletian, but hadn't let me in on it. Then they got upset when I didn't understand what I was doing or was supposed to do. There was a woman who I loved, past tense, and hated at the same time, desperately trying to keep someone from being burned alive, and there was Prow leaning against the wall trying to decide what to do. I did what anyone would do in those circumstances. I ran up to Giletian and started beating the crap out of him with my bare hands. I think the reason that I was so successful at it was that my pent-up anger at Prow. I had the strength of 10 men, maybe 20. I almost felt his bones crunch like tinfoil under my hands, but I knew then, even in the back of my mind, that I couldn't kill him. I had to restrain my anger. I managed to stop long enough to let him for him to speak, just barely. What are you doing? He groaned. Game over. You know as well as I do that I never would have taken this charade this far. You're going to give up that contact information to stop whoever is going to burn her house down, or you'll regret it. A look of horror crossed Giletian's face. But I can't stop it. You don't understand. It isn't going to be the person that does it. It was going to be the gas main. And how are you going to blow up the gas main? Explosives, I asked. No. It isn't like that. They just call me up and tell me when something is going to happen and how it's going to happen. I don't ask them questions. You're working for someone else now? Yes, he shrugged and smiled. I punched him in the face one more time just because it felt good. Who? I asked. No, you broke my nose. What? You broke my nose. I apologized. But I'm afraid I'm short of empathy right now, I said. If you could do your best to sputter the identity, Prow interrupted me. He said he doesn't know. Well, I think he does. Not necessarily. If someone is sufficiently clever in the way they covered it up, further beating this man is not only inhumane, but against the law. I looked at him like he was insane. Excuse me, but Darla's friend is about to be... Yes, and Darla is desperately trying to get a hold of her. I already informed the police. They will be able to handle the problem. When did you call the police? I sent a text message to the support squad. What support squad? Well, you know, the local police. They've been listening the whole time. So I simply sent them a text message and added a text message asking if they would contact the local authorities. You mean your entire plan? I asked, wiping the blood off my knuckles. Was to have a squad of police standing by? Not all of it. Almost all of it, Darla said, smiling a bit thinly, but visibly worried as she hung up the phone. Did you get through? I asked. Yes, thank you. Inze is out and even had time to get a few things out of the house. The police are already warning people around the block. There's a bomb. Quit trying to talk, Darla said curtly. No one can understand you anyway. The police will take you to the hospital first. No that bad, he said desperately. I understood what he said, and imagined Darla did too, though neither of us immediately moved to get him what he wanted. Prow had no such compunctions and stood up with a notepad. Giletian immediately began to write at a furious pace. He wrote, I don't take any action that makes things real. They send me videotapes of what's going to happen. Excuse me, I sneered. You expect us to believe that? Prow pondered. It's theoretically possible. No, it isn't. You don't get videotapes from the future, I rolled my eyes. Maybe, maybe not. There's a simple way to find out. What might that be? Darla asked. How do you get these tapes, Geletian? Do you contact them? Prow asked. Geletian shook his head and wrote, No, they contact me. Darla sighed. I don't think they're likely to do that now. Prow pondered. Maybe, maybe not. He bent down and looked at Geletian. You're willing to join in our little scheme, aren't you? You'd be more than willing to help us nail the bastards that tried to set you up and make them pay for their deceptions. Isn't that right? Geletian looked confused for a moment, then immediately nodded his head yes. He even grinned wickedly. He was going to enjoy this. I had to wonder if I looked like that when I had agreed to help Prow nail Geletian. We'd been sitting in the snow for over 4 hours. I hated snow. I hated snow so much that I had taken the incredibly risky chance at another job all the way across the country in the middle of the desert so I wouldn't have to see it again. Even when I had taken the job, I had known that there would be travel. Heck, we'd been to Alaska twice already, but in spite of all this, none of it could have prepared me for holding a camera in freezing weather just standing there. The Jeep drove up to Prow, and the general walked out. He talked with a small group of men, about equally divided between those in khaki uniform dress and the others wearing conservative winter dress, complete with sunglasses and ties. It was times like these that I wish I could read lips. The least they could have done was give me some kind of laser microphone or dish so I could understand them at a distance. I mean, what was the point of capturing all this in film if it wasn't recorded properly with sound? Prow, Darla, and Geletian began to walk up towards the gathered assembly. One of the men in sunglasses noticed them first and shouted a cry of alarm to the others. Prow motioned for them to halt, and they advanced towards him. One of the men in uniform took out a gun and was about to shoot him when Prow smiled and pointed directly at me. Most of them turned and looked in my direction. Of course, he didn't care if I couldn't hear anything. I was a decoy. Anything that involved a real recording device was going to be on Prow's person. He probably already had several cameras hidden around here, knowing the idiot, and had simply put me out here with the idea that he would eventually try and attack my position. At least that's what I thought they were going to do. It wasn't any more than 10 seconds before I felt something cold and metal pressing in the back of my neck. I can't explain how creepy it is to have something like this materialize right next to you, totally unseen. You should try it yourself. It's a hoot. A rough, deep voice commanded me, drop it. He made it sound like he was holding a sniper rifle or something. Then again, I suppose under the right circumstances, a camera would be worse. Needless to say, I complied. At the request of the person behind me, I marched forward. By now, I could hear bits and pieces of what was being said. Think away with this? General X asked. Prow smiled and said nothing. We moved closer. The closer the general looked at me. You look familiar, too. You were with Prow both times in Alaska. Yes, I was. Just how did you find this facility? He asked. Honestly, I don't know. Prow has a way of doing things I really don't understand. I do know he talked to Geletian for some time. Prow gave me a stern look, warned me not to say anything further. This simply motivated me to say more. You know what? I've seen you before, too. You were there right after we figured out that whole thing with the ceramic armor. Yes. I'm in charge of several highly classified projects. Like the one that was able to see in the past? I asked. Yes, the man replied. Suddenly it all fell into place. They really had a device that was capable of seeing into the future. I don't know how I figured it out. The part of me that hated Prow was screaming that I was becoming the very thing I loathed, but it just didn't seem to take this huge leap of logic for me, that what could be used to see into the past could also be used to see in the future. I had no idea how the physics of the thing worked. I vaguely recalled reading somewhere something about bending light around the universe. But what I did know was that these guys were not the kind of people who were about to divulge the secret of how their machine actually worked. I was wrong. The general smirked. The machine can't get the future right every single time. If it did, you wouldn't be here right now. Mr. Arthurson would be in jail, and you, Mr. Prow, would be a public laughingstock. Why? Darla asked. She was shaking her head. I couldn't help but agree. Mr. Prow was quite useful to us for a while in ferreting out unusual problems. But he has come unfortunately close a few times to taking cases that are not in our interests. So we decided to kill two birds with one stone. We get rid of his threat to us, and at the same time, plant firmly in the public mind how ridiculous the idea is of a machine that can read the future. That way, the next time a person who stumbles across the truth will think twice about exposing it. Prow nodded. Like you did with the car that ran on water. Something like that. I blinked. You actually had a car that ran on water? How is that possible without a fusion reactor? The general chuckled. It isn't. Are we, like, in the Twilight Zone or something? What the heck do you people talking about? Look, I don't care if you burn us to death or lock us up or torture us or whatever, but please, 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 please stop the comic book diatribe. It's making me want to vomit. I felt actually nauseous. This had nothing to do with the machine gun pointed at me. Nothing whatsoever. The general laughed. My, aren't we a little sadomasochistic, Mr. Arthurson? No, making too many people disappear is bad news. We'll just lock up one of the three of you. Oh, really? And who gets that honor? Why, you, of course. I shut up at that point. This was when Prow and Darla would rush to my defense. I found their silence deafening. Maybe they were thinking some different kind of lockup. Excuse me, but what do you mean? I asked. Exactly what you think we mean. You've committed several felonies, Mr. Arthurson. We can't touch Prow because of the other cameras he has hidden, can we, Mr. Prow? To his credit, Prow did not smile as he shook his head. The general continued, that, as annoying as it is, technically Mr. Prow hasn't broken any laws, at least not ones that will stick in court, and we certainly can't control the entire internet yet. But someone has to pay for this incident, Mr. Arthurson, and it certainly isn't going to be us. If it isn't Prow or his fiancée, that leaves you. I was speechless. I had turned around and helped him, and I had seen the light. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. I demand to see my lawyer. The FISA court will appoint you a lawyer with a proper security clearance, Mr. Arthurson, but if you don't like that one, then you can select from a dossier of 4 or 5 others. You can't do this. Can and are, Mr. Arthurson. Take him away, boys. It was at this point that 2 very large burly men with machine guns grabbed me by each arm and harnessed me under a large black Humvee that pulled up. I wish I could say that Prow and Darla looked sympathetic, but they didn't. It was only as I was thrown into the back seat that I realized I heard the general call Darla's Prow's fiancée. My disgrace was complete. It's very nice for prison. No one knows its undisclosed location, not even me, but I'm fairly confident it isn't anywhere near the vice president. It is, I believe, the first minimum security prison anywhere. The living accommodations involve television, moderately furnished rooms, food that a benevolent dictator might ascribe to his subjects, i.e. healthy, and the sheets are clean. It's only when you go towards one of the exits that you notice the nice heavily armored men with infantry-mounted machine guns pointed at you. The thing that galls me most about this is that, since Prow wasn't in the know, he filed a request for permitting me to fulfill my contract to him, namely the completion of this story. The warden pretty much interprets that as will write instead of may write. It amuses her to no end. And that ultimately the 17th draft I have completed thus far, granted the first one consisted of a 400 copied and pasted lines of I hate Quiescence Prow over and over and over again. The irony of this is that Prow may never get to read it, or even if he does, he's forbidden by law and federal regulation from showing it to anyone. Somehow, I don't think he really cares. Ultimately, while he would like to see his name in print, it is about making sure that someone somewhere is writing about his exploits. I think deep down he believes that he will be exonerated when it is discovered and filmed centuries after our demises. That's definitely Prow-think. The warden insists that I write at least one more paragraph. This is another sentence in the paragraph. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, one more thing I simply must include. I did get a care package from Prow and Darla, including an invitation to their wedding. Their photos are utterly nauseating. I find particular irony in Darla's letter saying that she's sorry for the misunderstanding and I hope we can still be friends when this is done. 10 years, 11 months, 14 days, 5 hours, 42 minutes, 43 seconds, until I can show them exactly how friendly I can be.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
So, welcome to the hidden commentary at the end of every chapter of this book. I I think that this chapter was... I'm going to give it a B minus. It's approaching B. For a chapter in the novel, it's pretty good. It advances our characters. It firmly sets the dynamic that lasts for a while. I do like some things I did well in this book, right? So I do like that Chester/Watson eventually calls himself Moriarty, opposes himself to Prow. The idea of a guy from the future a guy pretending to be from the future is a story that I've always wanted to write. In fact, actually, at this point, I may still do a short story on that. Frankly, I think it's kind of a cop-out that he actually ends up using visions from the future. I had set it up in previous chapters to have that happen, but I think one of the problems is that what I'm trying to do is go clearly in this novel with the Pink Panther part is episode of the week / monster of the week, Fringe meets X-Files meets person of interest. And the problem is that each of these technologies is so huge, right? The ability to see into the past or see into the future, that alone is a novel unto itself. And while you can totally go with the Tom Swift vibe, there should be more fringe science used by our heroes if we're going to do that. The reason I say that is because if you're going to go into the genre of pulp, which when you have this much fringe science, right, emergent digital intelligence from chapter 2, memetics in chapter 3, radioactivity detecting dogs in chapter 4, the heroes should be just as familiar with it or have their own version. If you're going to go Tom Swift, do Tom Swift. And while Darla is technical, she is not a master of science, capital S exclamation point. Prow fits well into that kind of a thing. Prow could easily wander under the pages of any Tom Swift / Hardy Boys novel, or Fringe, or Quiescent, or X-Files. He would be a weirdo, like the Lone Gunman, but he would fit. Chester's the straight man, so he would fit too. But I think that if I had to do this over again, and I still might, Darla or her equivalent, probably Finnish, is going to need to be a lot more technical. The audience needs to see that this kind of fringe science is the norm. And that's not what happens. Not really. We get there more and more and more. But like I said, it's just... some other problems with this chapter, in my opinion, are that last chapter I did at least a moderately good job of making each of the characters shine, and the minor characters shine too. And the would-be con man and the would-be Watson substitute are not interesting. I can't even, like, Gillettian. I mean, that's another problem is, back then, and just pick a name that normal people use and know how to pronounce. If you're going to have one or two unusual names, fine. But, like, I have so many characters in this book that have just ridiculously unpronounceable names. It's not even funny. And after these first 5 chapters, it's I shake up the format, and go more for a novel. But I'll be honest, each chapter gets a little bit better in terms of being a novel. And in my opinion, what I should have done is just literally rewrite the first 5 chapters and then go on to the other ones. If for some reason I decided to salvage this Frankenstein, which is not even anywhere near Frankenstein compared to the first novel, and I'll save that for when or if I do comments on that, which I probably will. I would definitely rewrite the first 5 chapters. Everything probably, I'd be better off just rewriting the whole thing from scratch. But if I was only going to rewrite part of it, I would literally scrap almost everything in the first 2 chapters, have just the origin part, go with chapter 3 as the origin, or the intro, then chapter 4, then chapter 5. I would scrap everything about Chester's relationship with Darla, because Chester has problems, but Chester doesn't need to be a creepy sociopath. And when I wrote it, that was not my intent. And, you could make the argument that the memes mess him up. And if so, that's great. But you need to show that, and you need to take the time to show that, right? In other words, and now that I think about it, having Chester become obsessed with Darla because of the meme sync thing would be a fantastic reason for his descent into madness. But I don't show that. And that would require at least 1 or 2 chapters between chapter 3, 4, and 5 of just pure exposition where they are not off solving a case. Sometimes you need to show that, right? I learned in the 5th novel, and am definitely reflecting that in the 7th novel, you need to take the time to write what you need. And I know it's always nice to finish a project, but a half-assed project does not help anyone, much less your reader. So, the current novel I'm writing is going to be 120,000 words. And while there's a lot of things in that plot, it's a much simpler plot. I can do an elevator pitch. How do I put this? So, the elevator pitch for this novel is a man who wants to be Sherlock Holmes, but is actually more like Jacques Clouseau, gets himself a Watson, and they solve Monster of the Week until a conspiracy unearths itself, and spoilers, they basically end up finding out that an independent nation wants to use these technological edges to set up themselves on an oil platform in the middle of the ocean, and every nation in the world tries to stop them from doing that. It's not the worst elevator pitch, but here's the elevator pitch for Army of Fire. The heir to a dark, conservative noble house in a magical, militaristic republic is the last survivor of a demon purge of her entire family, and is hidden on Earth until she comes of age, where to claim her inheritance, she must serve a year and a day in the military for the Republic and survive doing it. Much clearer. I'm not going to say simpler, because nothing about Inglemia is simple, but you can see the night and day difference between the elevator pitch, right? So since I'm trying to do a nominal education component of these comments, right, the lesson learned for the second novel is do the elevator pitch before you even write your outline, right? Know what the basics of the story that you're trying to write are before you even start writing it. Yes, absolutely. Feel free as a writer to explore things that appear that you did not anticipate, right? Do that. Every good writer will suddenly find that this character has a fantastic voice and you want to spend more time with them, right? Feel free to do that. But unless you discover that vein of ore, of gold in your writing, stick to the outline, right? Make an outline. In On Writing by Stephen King, which I cannot recommend enough, King basically kind of outlines two styles of writers. There's the Tolkien kind of writer who makes an outline and builds a world and plods through all of it. And then there is the sculptor kind of writer, which is what King is, where he takes a block of words and starts writing and sees where things take him. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. Most Tolkien-style writers, not all of them, but most of them, are a little bit drier. You can feel that their world is a little bit more formulaic. You can feel that their prose is a little bit more forced, and it's mechanical. Not always, but generally you can feel it, especially the more you write, the more you can see the technique of other writers in what you read. Conversely, with the sculptor writers like King, their prose and their characters are magical, right? They have the courage and the time and the talent, in the better cases, to go where they need to go. On the other hand, let's be honest, most of Stephen King's endings are terrible. He does not know how to end a story. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both styles of writing. I try and incorporate both. I would honestly say at this point I am becoming more and more an outline writer with the sculptor style within an outline. But I was definitely more of trying to do the sculptor writer in this, and the plot meanders all over the place, and there's no strength and there's no pacing, and it shows. If you're going to be a sculptor writer, you should write a hell of a lot of short stories before you even try and write a novel, in my opinion, which is exactly what Stephen King did.